Really excited about today because for a change, I've got a special guest here in the Fat Cave, and he's a bloke that I've been wanting to talk to for ages. Effectively, he's kind of me, which is scary, and I don't know how he feels about that, but we'll find out in a minute, but in a different domain. The chap's name is Michael West. He's an independent journalist, and I first became aware of him when he lifted the lid on a whole bunch of corporate tax dodgers here in Australia, and he's done a whole bunch of other brave journalism, right? And if you really need to know what's going on in the society around you as it sort of crumbles, I'd strongly suggest you check out his channel, which is The West Report. I'll put a link in the description. And basically, this is going to be just completely unscripted off the bat, and it's going to be a Joe Rogan-esque chat in two parts, right? Part one on this channel and part two over on Michael's channel. So with all that out of the way, g'day, Michael. Nice to meet you.
G'day, John. Pleasure to be in the Fat Cave.
Yeah, deep below stately Chateau Shitsville.
Birds tweeting in the background. Superb environment.
Nature. Okay, so for people who aren't aware of you, how would you categorise yourself?
Well, a bit like you, John, in some respects. Ex-mainstream or corporate media, a refugee from corporate media, who has gained some audience outside by virtue of the great luxury of simply being able to tell the truth.
That is a scary concept, right? And it shouldn't be, because one of the things you should be able to rely on a journalist to do is accurately report what's happening around you. And yet, when I decided to do that, I had to really take a big leap of faith to do that. And once I'd done it, I looked around. It was kind of like Dresden on the 15th of February, 1945. So I'm kind of interested to find out your experience of departing from the fold and actually telling the truth. What was that like for you?
Well, I've always worked for big institutions. News Corp for 8 years, Rupert Murdoch's the Australian newspaper, and then the Sydney Morning Herald, where I started at the Fin Review and then came back. So essentially, if you're a print journo, particularly a business or finance journo, well, that's where I started. You only have two shops in town. Well, you can go to TV, but it's either the Herald and the Age Fin Review, which is Fairfax, or News Corp, which is essentially the Australian in serious business. So I got sacked for the crime of journalism in early 2016. I didn't care much because my dad had just died and we were very close. And I just said, well, what am I going to do now? So I went to Bali for a few weeks and came back and decided, well, I'm not just going to continue what I'm doing, journalism. And of course, there are barriers to entry, but they're low from a cost point of view, starting your own website and so on. So I put my redundancy check in there. And just started to just do investigative stuff, just have a crack, do stuff that people wouldn't do properly in the corporate media or the mainstream media. And self-censorship now is a big problem, besides actually, as you know, from Channel 9 and Channel 7 being tapped on the shoulder by the people that have been chatting with advertising managers for large multinational car companies.
Yeah.
So you've got that pressure, but you've also got the pressure. You know, you've got your mortgage, you're being paid X amount and you want to keep your job, and you have a pressure to bite your lip sometimes and not tell the truth because you know it's going to upset somebody.
I was going to say, this is a key point about the truth, and I don't think ordinary people get this, okay? When you tell the truth, someone's going to hate it. And if it's a good story, it's usually the person about whom, or the organisation about which you tell the truth, right? And they can come after you in some pretty serious ways. Like corporations in particular have infinite resources to pursue someone like you or me. And you've been sort of stung with the odd defo threat, haven't you?
I got 6 last year, even from a bloke who had a website, ripped off all my content and put it on his own website. And then when I pointed this out on social media, he threatened to sue me. So, you know, it also by people with a bit of dough, they're the ones you've got to worry about because defamation's expensive. You've got to hire lawyers and so on. Because
it's not really often about the damage that you might have done to their reputation. It's about shutting you up.
It's about muzzling you. Or just almost, I think 99% of the time it's that. I'd say there's 1 out of 100 where they really do feel injured and they do want to take you to court and they do want, usually it's just to force you to take a story down that you've done. And so you just go back and you say, well, the facts are correct, so I'm not going to take it down. And then they can ramp it up a bit and threaten you a bit more. And, we're going to take it to the cleaners. Well, the essential threat is we'll take your house off you if you don't take the story down, apologise in words of our choosing, and pay for the cost of this letter that we just threatened you with.
One of the funniest things I ever learnt, this was when they were training us to be radio hosts, right? They got some high-ranking solicitor to come in who was an expert at this kind of thing, and he said, one of the last things you ever want to say if anyone pursues you is don't say, I didn't mean it, right? Because then you lose your defence of honest opinion, right? And there's all these kind of really kooky things that go into that side of the business. But there is a really serious aspect to this. And I kind of do a very similar thing to what you do in the domain about cars. Like, I don't give a shit what a car company thinks when I do a report, right? It's the furthest thing from my mind. It's like it's not even there. I'm not trying to annoy them, but if they don't like it, okay.
Too bad.
And this leads to doing a whole bunch of stories that other outlets won't do, like covering things like Volkswagen's record fine for breaches of consumer law.
And actually calling it a criminal conspiracy, which is what it was, rather than saying, it's not very good.
Well, they've been a bit naughty.
They've been a bit naughty, but of course, it gets back to the money, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you are paid by corporate advertisers, large car companies, then it is very hard to present an honest opinion about them.
Yeah, and then who comes first, right? Is the media there to inform the audience, or is it just there as a delivery system for advertising? If advertisers come first, then the audience goes under the bus and they don't get the truth.
So you're servicing one or the other.
Yeah. And one of the stories that blew me away that you did, which is just blah, 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 like this, was that interview with David McBride. And for those of you who don't know, David McBride is a former soldier. He was a lawyer in the Defence Force, and he's written a cheque, right? He went to places like Afghanistan, and he wrote a cheque payable in the sum of up to his own life at any time. So this is a serious commitment to the nation, and he became very concerned about the conduct of the Defence Force generally over there. And he tried to get that resolved, didn't he? Like, this is the thing about whistleblowers, okay? Like, he's a guy who's got unimpeachable credentials, as I see it, and he tried to get these issues resolved from within. And the only reason he blew the whistle was because that resolution would not be forthcoming through official channels, right?
Absolutely. But the irony, of course, is that we get a pat on the back from people saying, oh, thank goodness you're doing some journalism there, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with your opinion.
Yeah.
But I always say, well, hang on, we're just doing our job. We're meant to be doing that. The failure is in the rest of the corporate media. In McBride's case and the case of all the other whistleblowers, Bernard Collaery in the Timor-Leste situation and so on, these guys that are fighting the government and large corporations, that is beyond their call of duty. They're not just doing their job. If they're doing their job, they could shut up, earn their money and just go and have a whinge at a dinner party.
Sure.
But these guys are really showing particular courage and the public interest.
Mr. McBride is looking down the barrel of, effectively, because of his age, he's looking down the barrel of potentially spending the rest of his life in prison.
Life in jail, yeah.
And he sort of shrugged that off when you interviewed him. It's like, yeah, well, if that's the price I pay for doing that kind of thing. And that's a gutsy effort. And I don't know why the rest of the media is not all over that kind of thing, because when you look at what does get a run, Kylie's cellulite shame sort of thing as an alternative, then there's issues that matter and there's issues that don't matter. And often a lot of these issues that matter, they don't get a run.
Well, defence, of course, defence reporting is highly compromised, because you're not going to put, if you're a mainstream or the ABC, you're not going to put somebody there if they're going to ask too many questions and question, the ridiculous excess and wastage of government defence spending, like the other day when we wrote about the $3 or $4 billion that Dutton's spending on tanks for an island, things like that. I mean,
yeah, we've already got a moat.
We've got the moat.
What do we need the tanks for?
That's right. So, I mean, if you're going to start questioning that stuff, you're going to be moved from defence to, leisure and cuisine or something like that. You're not going to be around a defence for long. So I think the self-censorship thing is even bigger than the actual direct editorial interference, because as a journalist, and I don't blame the young journalists, it's the management of these companies which has failed.
Sure.
And now it's so widespread, the failure of mainstream media, and as independent media grows to make up that vacuum, to compensate, it's so widespread that you've got to wonder where it's going to from here. I mean, where does it end?
Well, here's the thing that I see in motoring, right? Car companies have this sort of little tiny enclave of domesticated motoring journalists, and they sling them a car every week and they invite them on all the gigs, right? They go on all the launches, and pre-COVID that meant platinum frequent flyer status. I'm off to Milan for a couple of days kind of thing. And all you've got to do, and they never actually say that, right? But the implicit contract that you enter into if you want to join that club is just say nice things about us, you know, and if you wouldn't mind, just water down the criticism. I know you've got to be critical of the car to some degree, but could you just make it inconsequential?
Bury it in the 10th paragraph.
Yeah, right at the end, and just don't make it too harsh, and we'll invite you back next time kind of thing. And I see that everywhere. I see it in the political domain. I see it in the general news domain, because I don't see too much harsh criticism of Harvey Norman, ever.
Well, Harvey Norman gets a free ticket. I mean, there's all sorts of issues around Harvey Norman. It's accounting and so on. It's dominance. It's refusing to pay back JobKeeper. There's all sorts of things, but of course you won't, because Harvey Norman is perhaps the biggest, corporate advertiser. I mean, they buy out the front page of newspapers. So these guys running these newspapers are saying, here, have my front page. That's how much I feel about my editorial integrity. I'm going to make it the Harvey Norman Herald, the Harvey Norman Age. And you got to wonder where it's going, because corporations are getting bigger and more powerful. Their power over democracy is growing. They all donate corporately to the two major political parties. They get bigger. There's a rash of takeovers on at the moment. Since COVID started, you've got a massive one. You've got these guys from Brookfield, these tax haven guys coming after AusNet at the moment, which is an $18 billion deal. Now that's going to go. That pays $100 million a year tax. That's going to evaporate. That'll go to the Caymans or Bermuda.
Yeah.
And so will control of that asset. Because these guys are notorious tax dodgers. And I say that about them the whole time, and I never hear boo out of them, because it's easy to prove. All you got to do is go and get their accounts, and you go, how much tax you pay last year? You got $5 billion in income. Oh, zero tax again for 7 years in a row.
I know. How does that work? I mean, if these corporations paid tax at a tenth of the rate that you and I pay tax, the nation would be awash in money, seemingly, because there's all of these corporations that pay no tax, because ostensibly they've got a head office in, I don't know, friggin' Dublin or something.
Well, they just do deals to siphon the money out. Usually they give themselves loans from overseas called debt loading. This is how the big Exxon and Chevron do it. And the interest on those loans goes over to some other place overseas, and that's before the tax line. So that's one way. I mean, there are lots of ways, transfer pricing and all that. But the interesting thing was, I've done a little bit on the motoring industry. I've gone through a few sets of accounts, because they're not easy to get. You've got to go to ASIC, pay them $41 for this public information. And these guys, they fax it in. And so some of it's blurred and stuff like, I mean, it is insane what they will do to hide and obfuscate. But the car companies, they're bad. They're big tax avoiders. But in their defense, and John, I've watched many of your videos referring to the competition in the market. The one thing I would say about cars, unlike fossil fuels, the gas sector, which is a cartel, unlike media, unlike lots of sectors, there is competition in cars.
Oh, they hate
there
each
are
other.
bona fide losses.
Yeah.
And when they stuff up, they make losses and they don't have to pay tax, which is natural. But they can store those tax losses for years. That's the problem.
Well, that's why Nissan pays no tax, because they used to make cars here and they incurred loss after loss after loss, and they're just carrying it forward.
Just match it to the profits every year.
And then, of course, if it goes really bad, in the case of Holden, you don't exist anymore. Oops-a-daisy.
Well, this is a classic to do with the media and car reporting, because I know, not very well, but the car reporters at the Australian and Fairfax and that sort of thing, and we occasionally have a chat, and I'd say, look, I'm just trying to get hold of the General Motors, the GM accounts or the Holden accounts and the Ford accounts and Toyota. Oh, yeah, I wouldn't know. No, so
Well,
there's no money trail understanding, but they are, as you say, driving around in a brand new flash car every week.
And you don't get to be the motoring reporter because you got tired of being the lead investigative reporter or the national political affairs correspondent. You're usually sort of a little bit further down the barrel than that, more like in the turd mine rather than the creme de la creme of investigative journalists.
And you're the only guy at each company doing it. There's only one motoring reporter. Yeah. Maybe it was different back in the day, but usually there's one in each media organisation, isn't there? You were at 9 and 7 and so on. So that gives them protection because people don't actually quite know what they do. But it was funny when you say, when GM and Ford are about to leave the country, have you seen the Goldman having a look at their accounts? And when you get them, you're going, hey, look at this money. They siphoned out these loans to themselves to Mexico in the case of General Motors. Yeah. And Ford had some other scam going. But there is, at least in that market, John, there's competition in cars. It's probably the second biggest market in Australia after houses, I guess.
Certainly with relevance to consumers. There's a huge market in fossil fuels, though, obviously, because...
Well, that's a big export market, of course.
Yeah, and domestic consumption too, because 30 billion litres of liquid fossil fuels and untold tonnes of coal being burnt in Australia for the grid. So there's a lot of onshore consumption as well. I just don't understand. I've always wondered about this. We've got some of the cheapest liquid fuel in the world, and that's principally because we pay some of the lowest levels of taxation on fuel. And I know average Australians hate buying fuel. It's a grudge purchase. They all think it's a rip-off, but go to Italy and buy a litre of petrol and see how you feel about that.
Cheaper than elsewhere.
Yeah. So how have we arrived in a situation where we've got some of the cheapest liquid fuel, but we pay some of the highest electricity prices? I don't get that. We got more coal than just about anyone else.
Well, electricity has a quirk in the structure of the market where the major companies that operate the grid and feed in their coal power or their renewables or whatever, they go and they set the prices themselves. They say, this is how much it's going to cost me for the next, I've got to spend this money on these transmission lines. There's 300 million there. And so that has to go. And then the regulator, who's basically a small crew of people, are up against armies of lawyers and consultants and engineers who've done engineering reports. Oh, we'll have to spend 300 million on these, the big coat hangers, the transmission line. These sort of things all go on the bill in the end. And so over a period of 20 years after they corporatised it and then privatised it, and of course they split it into umpteen different companies, retailers and wholesalers and distributors. So, the poles and wires people, and each one of those had to have their own human resources, public relations, executive team, finance and legal. They all had these different little kingdoms and infrastructures, and that just went to the cost. Back in the day, the head of the New South Wales SEC would trudge up the street to Macquarie Street to Senate estimates, and he'd sit down in front of 3 or 4 politicians and they'd say, your electricity prices are up 3% this year. This is bad. And the guy would go, yeah, we had a few blackouts, and they had to explain themselves because there was only one bloke, and he was the face of it all, the grey cardigan face of the bureaucracy. But he had to explain himself. There was accountability.
Now there's 4,000 senior executive managers of this and that at different organisations, and it's bigger than Ben Hur.
And it's all controlled. A lot of it's controlled. The gas pipelines are controlled by Singapore and China, and there's a lot of foreign fossil fuel companies in it. They're not really responsible or accountable. They're pretty opaque. The mainstream media never holds them to account, or rarely holds them to account, unless there's a big scandal. And then they all pile in and bayonet the dead, like in the Volkswagen. They'll ignore the story, and then suddenly they'll have to cover it. And then it's overkill on one company,
Okay, so it's been an interesting few years. The last 3 years in particular has been, let's be kind, interesting. And I finally crossed this threshold where I'm actually embarrassed to be Australian, right? I just am. I would hate to be in the United Kingdom or America or Italy or France and have to explain to some person that I'm Australian, because we've become a global laughingstock and we've sort of become inured to the status quo being anyone in authority, ScoMo or Gladys or Dan Andrews, anyone like that, it's kind of acceptable now for them just to vomit bullshit in front of a camera and we all swallow and we don't get a say in it. And I'm just wondering how we came from the Australia that you and I grew up in and how we've developed into this society where the staple diet is bullshit. How did that happen?
Well, it comes back to media and the control of media by government, which we were talking about before, and by corporations that fund the political parties and so on. And I think, there used to be a thing called the doctrine of ministerial accountability. There was that bloke that came in on the plane with a teddy bear for his grandchild. He came in and he brought a teddy bear in that he didn't declare at customs, and he had to fall on his sword because he'd broken the rules. And now there aren't any rules. There's just, but the media isn't holding them to account. This is the problem. They're getting soft-shoed all over the place.
But the thing I'm talking about with bullshit here is like Gladys Berejiklian is not stepping down because of allegations of corruption. She's a victim of ICAC, right? That's like framing the debate in these patently bullshit ways, and everybody's just sitting there going, and the narrative is she's a victim.
Well, it's a lack of understanding. I mean, Gladys is a classic example. I mean, ICAC is just an exploratory body that goes and does the analysis and finds if there's a case.
Sure.
It doesn't press charges. It's the DPP. It presents a case of the DPP, and then they might take it to court. So it's not a witch hunt body. It doesn't have those kind of powers. And of course, that was framed poorly. It's the triumph, John. It's a triumph of PR too. Remember, we're probably about the same vintage. I remember when I first started in journalism, there were no PRs. I called the head of Woolworths, a guy called Paul Simon. I got straight to call his secretary as a junior reporter, straight through to the head of Woolworths.
That would never happen.
Now they've got a phalanx of public relations people.
Sure.
Every company, every politician's got public relations people. In the old days, there used to be, even a few years after that, there was about one PR for every 10 journalists. And now there would be 20 PRs for every one journalist.
Like, how many spin doctors would ScoMo have on staff? Like, the Prime Minister's department is huge. But...
Well, a lot of it's external consultants set up, but his Prime Minister's department, he'd probably have, we've checked this out because there's something like 10 or 11 that we could find, fossil fuel related people in ScoMo's office. So it's no wonder fossil fuels have such a big say. His chief of staff, his major advisors, all fossil fuel linked. And there's so much money there trying to preserve the status quo, But he would probably he'd have access to all sorts of PR advice, but there'd be a number of PRs, maybe 5, 10, 15 in his department. Depends how you frame them. I mean,
sure.
Are they real black arts ones, or are they press release writers, or what are they?
How many interns are there? And all that kind of stuff. Yeah. It is nuts, though, because there's two different things, right? There's doing what's right for the nation, and then there's talking about it. And it seems to me that talking about it's become more important than doing what's right, because what's right is like, let's take a look at what the voters think about that, or which way are the polls running when the classic case is taking 4 days or whatever it was to evict Novak Djokovic, right? It's like, which way is the electorate leaning on this? And we'll jump the way that's going to just garner the most support from the electorate.
It's all focus
It's not
groups.
about what's right. It's not defending our borders. If you believe the Prime Minister, it's keeping our borders strong. Got to get rid of him.
He was found to be unpopular. They sniffed the breeze after a few days. They went, we're going to get votes out of this. If we chuck him out of the country, we'll go strong on borders. Of course, nothing to do with that. But John, the triumph of image over substance is what's happened, absolutely. And the fact that there's no accountability, mind you, the government's been running with a 1-seat majority, so it would totally fall in more of a heap if they did lose that. So they've got to protect people, like Christian Porter and these sort of people. They have to protect them just to keep their power. So
Mr. Potato Head wants a slush fund, essentially,
to sue journalists.
To sue anybody who defames them, like Jordan Shanks, for example. Or, I don't know if you'd categorise Jordan as a journalist. He's certainly not a mainstream journalist, but he does some pretty freaking good stories.
Well, he's better than most journalists because he doesn't rewrite press releases. It's all original.
He does his own work.
I mean, he does a lot of entertainment stuff, but he does a lot of deep investigation.
Yeah.
Got people around him that help him with that. He gets a lot of tips because they know that he'll have a crack and he'll try and get to the bottom of it, and he's not in fear of defamation. He's not in fear of being tapped by Nissan on the Nissan Public Relations Department or the people up the chain from him, because there is nobody up the chain. He can't lose his house because he hasn't got one, to lawyers.
But yet, he
has a bit of freedom that other people don't have.
Yeah, but if you listen to John Barilaro, the former Deputy Premier of New South Wales, during his resignation announcement, Gladys might have been a victim of ICAC. John Barilaro, according to him, was a victim of online YouTube comedian Jordan Shanks.
He's a victim of a comedian.
Come on. How can you be a victim of a comedian?
It's a tragedy.
We really have entered bullshit world. The world is built on a foundation of bullshit now, because there's no question that the timing of ICAC and the resignation of those two from New South Wales politics, that wasn't coincidental. Didn't seem coincidental to me.
No, it's not coincidental. But Gladys is a classic case in point. Very popular in the mix. It's all about image and stuff like that. And she does present as somebody with a lot of conviction. So she'd get up every day. We follow the health advice. You must follow the health advice. Everybody follow the health advice. And of course we just put in the clearing away the forest for the trees. I said to Callum, who I work with, could just ring him up and ask him what the actual health advice is. Can we get a look at this health advice, this magical health advice?
And this would have been the first time they'd been asked that question.
Well, nobody asked them, what is the health advice?
Yeah.
We spent something like 8 weeks, and finally we put an FOI in, went through the proper channels, and we got, not the health advice, we got a list of their video appearances, the daily press conferences, just sort of links to those.
Really?
So they're very cynical about it. They don't care because they've got the media on their side. And the media is on their side because the media is bought off from political donations, from the... If you look at what's happening now, the systems... I come from the finance journalism world. You're in cars. That's happening in politics too. You've got the messages from the PMO, from the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, funneled through the big news, their big decisions in the national interest or not, coming through this funnel into a small clique of journalists. And then I'm not criticising the journalists, because if they don't run a story because they think it's rubbish, they're going to get a call from their editor the next day saying, hey, the Australian had this story, the Age had this story, why don't we have this story? Well, Guardian's in that position, unfortunately. They've got to write some rubbish occasionally, even though they don't like it, because if they don't, they get frozen off the list, like the motoring journalist that writes the true story.
Well, we're all on a field, we're all on a playing field, right? And playing fields have rules. And if you're a player and you don't adhere to the rules, you get sin-binned, right? And it's just that the rules are not in the public interest anymore.
No, they aren't. And the question, of course, is where it... If you can tell me, please do. Where does it go to from here? Because it has got to the ridiculous point. Donald Trump, of course, helped, because people were watching him just lying every day and just not caring. And that's what we've got now with Scott Morrison. He couldn't sue you. Well, he could try for defamation for calling him a liar, which people do all the time, because...
You've got the truth defence.
You've got... Mind you... Truth defence isn't everything. They can still come after you and wait and soak up a lot of your money in lawyers' fees.
It can cost you a lot to win.
It can cost you a lot to win that, to even get to the courtroom steps. But that's what's happened. I think people have figured out, well, people are going to like me or hate me anyway. You've got a certain amount of people that are set voters on either side. We've just got to capture the middle. That's our game.
Or the swinging whatever, because then you tend to pander to extremists, though, don't you? Like the extreme views one way or the other. Like there's a risk that average Australians get thrown under the bus because they're kind of rusted on one way or the other. And then people on the fringes are the ones you can more or less appeal to.
That's what you got to get. And that's why all this money, the pork barrelling money, is like never before. People have tried to put a price tag on it, 16 billion of our money being used to buy votes in marginal electorates or ones where they think they can tip the scales. And it's all down to spreadsheets, colour-coded spreadsheets, as we know. So it's become but it is a big game of bullshit. There's no doubt about that. And what we've seen at the same time over the last few years is eroding credibility in government. And my point is that the problem with eroding credibility is that governments no longer have a license to make any brave, courageous, logical policy and reform because they don't really have a mandate for the people because nobody trusts them.
Well, this is a very important point, and this is the most worrying thing about living on bullshit world, right? Because you and I and everybody who watches this report, right, we've got a contract with society, and most of us have a functioning contract with society. We buy in. When the sons of anarchy kick the front door down and you call the cops, you expect them to turn up, right? And if you fall off your ladder and break your leg, you expect the ambos to turn up, right? Because this is part of the reciprocity of your contract with society. But what I see now is we see the death of trust, not just in politicians, but we see the death of trust in major institutions. We see the death of trust in experts, like people who've spent 20 years of their lives learning how to be virologists. I trust them on the issue of vaccines because I spent 7 years of my life learning how to be an engineer, and I know what makes that beam stop the floor from collapsing, you know? So anybody who's serious enough to be a world-leading virologist, I'm going to trust what they say because you can't do that frivolously. You can't become that virologist frivolously. So if they say the mRNA vaccines are the leading technology to provide the maximum protection, not just for you, but for society generally, and if we all do it, we protect the vulnerable, I go, But a lot of people let this distrust in the system, let's say, they let that erode their trust in institutions and experts whom, in my view, we should still have faith.
Well, this is a brilliant point because there is a broader thing. It's not just about government. The proximity of major institutions to government is a problem too. The fact that a lot of them make the political donations and get something in return in government spending or whatever. But the point is, well, we do trust the virologists, but do we trust the department?
Do we trust Pfizer's virologist?
Well, this is it. But the point is that no, there's been a general eroding of trust in other institutions, in mainstream media, in
authority.
Now, one thing that speeding up because one thing that really got me, and I can't believe they were allowed to get away with it, was JobKeeper.
Oh yeah.
I mean, here's $90 billion, $89 billion in public money that I concede the government needed to move quickly and the scheme was never going to be perfect. There was always going to be waste. But when they knew that people were gaming it, now, if you look at who was gaming it, we're talking wealthy private schools who increased their surplus during that time.
Yep.
We're talking Harvey Norman. We're talking about all the major corporations, unless, well, the banks didn't because they were rolling in profits from other government policy decisions. But something like 40 billion of it was wasted on companies that did not need it. And how much has been paid back? Just a fraction has been paid back. So people have just gone, well, I looked at the doctors' colleges, the Royal Society of this and the Royal thing of this. Their thing was, well, everyone else is doing it. And of course, you couldn't get through to the head guy because they're protected by sort of armed guards. They're PR people.
A phalanx of
PR people who say, can you send us an email, please, before we give you our no comment?
Sure.
And so you can't even get through to these guys to hammer them. There is, because they're protected, there's no accountability. And it's, well, everyone else is doing it. And they're right, everyone else is doing it.
Well,
so it's almost unfair to go after one bunch of people like Gerry Harvey because everybody, it was a complete orgy, a total free-for-all. It was, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, this mob coming after me at the moment, this Shine Lawyers mob, no win, no fee. I just checked there, and there they are. They've got it as well. I mean, and they, dramatic increase in revenue. So it was roundly gamed. When they knew it was happening, they let it keep happening. and nobody did anything about it. And Josh Frydenberg doesn't appear to care. He's the architect of the scheme, but
it's not his money, is it?
Well, it's not his money. And of course, who were the people that he consulted with during this period? AI Group, which is a business PR lobby, funded also by weapons manufacturers, and BCA. And if you look at the members of the Business Council of Australia, which is the blue chip, the blue ribbon, the elite, most powerful business lobby in Australia, more than 50% of them, or around half of them, are controlled by foreign multinationals.
Of course.
So it could just as easily, if truth was a thing anymore, John, be called the Business Council of Foreign Multinationals.
Oh, perfect. See, AP Eagers was one of those companies, and don't quote me on the specificity of these numbers, but they made something like $150-something million profit. And I think it was 138 of that was JobKeeper, right? And they didn't pay it back. And one of the wheels, I think it was the chairman or the former chairman of AP Eagers, was grilled about it by someone. And he said, we've got no intention of paying it back because we have an obligation to our stakeholders. And what he's really saying is, we took that money from the Australian taxpayer and we paid it to our shareholders because that's more important to us than the underlying morality of our conduct.
Indeed, that is their director's duty, to maximise wealth for their shareholders.
But doesn't that exist within a framework? In an ideal world, I guess, that would exist within a framework where morality was a thing.
And I think the moral justification for this is business is tough, business is business, we have to represent shareholders, everybody else is doing it. It's also a moral equivalence and
that's the Nuremberg defence.
It is, that's right. It's just following orders.
Yeah.
Just following what shareholders wanted, whatever. And look, they did it too. This kind of thing. Like I looked at a few of them specifically. I was the first one to go out with it, actually. I busted Mirvac, a huge property developer. It doesn't pay any tax. It's got a tricky staple security. It gets government work. It's just a license to print money. And they were doing it. Go into them. Can you explain yourself? No, go away. We're not going to talk to you. But Lendlease, who I was hammering at the time for tax avoidance because they hadn't paid tax for 10 years or thereabouts, they actually made a moral decision. Well, it was a reputational decision. They went to the board and they decided not to take. They might have taken a bit at first in the first tranche. They decided not to take it. So companies did it, but they did it to preserve their reputation. They didn't do it because it's the right thing to do. But
I think we'll leave it there, Michael. That was part one of a much longer conversation with Michael West. Thank you very much for watching. If you'd like to catch up with part two, it's available right now over on Michael's channels, and I'll put a link in the description for them.